Welcome to this video where I'll be giving a brief overview of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, particularly for those who are new to the Christian faith or who would like to know more about what Christians call the Old Testament. It is in these 5 books that we meet Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and his sons, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob, who was called Israel, and his 12 sons whose descendants became the 12 tribes of Israel, as well as Moses, the great leader of Israel, and his brother Aaron, the first high priest. In these books we learn about the perfection of creation, about the human propensity to sin, about God's great plan of redemption, and how God made everlasting promises, entering into covenant with certain individuals, with their descendants, and with the whole world. It is also in these books that we find the giving of the law, including the 2 greatest commandments, to love God and to love everyone else. I'll investigate these things in a bit more detail as we go through these books. These are the foundational books of both Judaism and Christianity. For Christians, the Torah is sometimes called the Pentateuch because there are 5 books. But in the New Testament itself, they are collectively referred to as either the books of Moses or simply as the law, which is the standard English translation of the Hebrew word Torah. The Hebrew scriptures are divided into 3 parts: the law, or Torah, the prophets, or Nevi'im, and the writings, or Ketuvim. The books of the prophets, those sent to remind Israel of the covenant, do not explicitly quote from the Torah. Whilst this may seem odd to us today, when extensive references are essential to avoid accusations of plagiarism, the practice of citation only began much later, during the time of the Roman Empire. The prophets pointed the Israelites back to the covenant law and the promises God had made through their verbal announcements, their illustrative actions, and with the written accounts we are now left with. In the writings we are also often pointed back to the law, with the psalmists so often reminding us to meditate on the Torah, to let it fill our thoughts, and the wisdom authors pushing us to listen to God's instruction. The New Testament, on the other hand, has many direct references and quotes from the Torah. From the opening of John's Gospel, which echoes the beginning of Genesis, to Jesus quoting Deuteronomy to rebuke the devil in the wilderness, to Paul's frequent references to the law, to the anonymous scholar behind the book of Hebrews who so carefully expounds the Torah and shows how Jesus is the fulfillment of the covenant promises. Understanding the Torah and the covenant promises therein was essential for the early Christians and for the authors of the New Testament. So who wrote the Torah? Ancient tradition holds that all 5 books were written by Moses, and at various points in their narrative we're told that Moses wrote down all that he was commanded. Critical scholars have placed the writing and compilation of the Torah much later and from a variety of authors, which is necessary for many of them. If you don't believe in God, miracles or prophecy, then books which accurately describe events must have been written after those events took place. For example, God telling Abraham that his descendants would be slaves for 400 years. But if you believe in the God who knows the end from the beginning and who often explains exactly what's going to take place to his people before it happens, then this is not a problem. The details contained within the book of Genesis all take place long ago, with the last events a few hundred years before Moses was born. Either these stories would have been passed down and collated by whoever was the final editor, together with words of commentary, or would have needed to be directly revealed by God. The beginning of the book of Exodus gives us Moses' origin story, the early part of which could have been relayed to Moses by his sister Miriam, who played a major role. For the rest of Exodus, all of Leviticus and Numbers, and most of Deuteronomy, Moses is a major character. Now, clearly the end of the story, where Moses dies and is buried, could not have been written by him. And the epilogue, which, with phrases like "until this day," must certainly have been written later. But taken at face value, most of the Torah could indeed have been first collated and written down by Moses, with some additions made later, perhaps by his successor Joshua, and with some small edits made by the scribes. Clearly, in this life, everyone will not be able to agree on who wrote each part of the Torah. But the key for Jews and Christians alike is not who first wrote down each word or what writing materials were used, but rather that the active inspiration for these books comes from the same place as the rest of Scripture. This is not Moses' story, it is God's story. And we believe that God inspired the writing of these words and their preservation throughout history for the benefit of all of those who will read them. So let's take a look at each of the 5 books separately before we talk more about why they are collectively called Torah or law. Our first book is Genesis, and it begins at the beginning. Both the English title Genesis and the Hebrew title Bereshit, taken from the first words of the book, refer to this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created everything. Having covered the origin of creation, Genesis then covers 9 more origin stories, which each begin, "These are the generations of." Adam and Eve, the first people, having been created to live in paradise with God, disobeyed the one simple rule God had given them. We then see how quickly things escalate when Cain, their son, kills Abel, his brother, and from here things go downhill. By the time of Noah, the world is described as wicked, and God destroys the world with a flood. But Noah and his family are saved by God through the building of an ark. God makes the first explicitly stated covenant with Noah and with the whole world, as he makes a binding promise that he will never again destroy the whole earth with a flood. The sons of Noah are then charged to repopulate the earth, and God disperses the people after the Tower of Babel. Then the story narrows down to just one of Noah's sons, Shem, and his descendants. Then it narrows down further to the son of Terah named Abram, who God would call Abraham. God makes a covenant with Abram that his descendants will be a great nation, that through Abram all the nations will be blessed. This and other covenants detailed in the Torah take a form that would have been familiar to people at the time. Suzerains, powerful kings, would make treaties with their vassals, less powerful kings, with responsibilities on both sides. But it is God who takes the burden of this covenant on himself, with Abram and his male descendants having to be marked by circumcision, a sign of the covenant. Abram and his wife Sarai were by this time very old and remained childless. So we hear the story of Ishmael, an attempt to fulfill the promise of God through human strength, as Abram has a son with Sarai's servant Hagar. We then have the story of Isaac, the son who had been promised, who arrives in God's timing, and there follows the testing of Abraham, as God asks him to sacrifice Isaac, although God intervenes and himself provides the sacrifice. We have the story of Isaac's twin boys, Jacob and Esau, who were rivals from the womb, and the story of how Jacob ended up marrying 2 sisters, and how the angel of the Lord wrestles with Jacob, which is when God changed his name to Israel. We then have the story of Esau and his descendants. Our final origin story is about Joseph, Jacob's 11th and favourite son with his fancy coat, and how God uses the jealousy of his brothers to take Joseph to Egypt, where he ends up enslaved and imprisoned before rising to become the second in charge of the land. The book of Genesis finishes with Jacob's family, 70 people in all, finding refuge in Egypt. Our second book is Exodus. The English title refers to the key event of the Israelites being led out of Egypt by God through Moses and into the wilderness. The Hebrew title of the book, Shemot, which means names, is again taken from the first words of the book, and these are the names. The first few sentences of the book recount how Jacob, known as Israel, and his children came down to Egypt, and how things were good for a few hundred years, and how the literal children of Israel multiplied until a new Pharaoh came to the throne. This Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites just as God had told Abraham. We then have the well-known story of Moses as a baby being placed into a basket and floated out onto the Nile, adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh and growing up in the palace, attended to by his older sister Miriam. We then jump to Moses at the age of 40, killing an Egyptian to save a Hebrew slave before fleeing to the wilderness for another 40 years. The pace of storytelling then slows down, and we have Moses encountering the burning bush on the mountain and being told by God that he will lead Israel out of Egypt. Despite Moses' humility and ritual protest, we then see Moses with his brother Aaron going to Pharaoh and asking for God's people to leave Egypt. God sends 10 miraculous signs or plagues to reveal his power over the false gods of Egypt. Water turning to blood, countless frogs, lice, flies, diseased livestock, boils, hail and fire, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn children of Egypt. Just before this last plague, at God's command, Moses institutes the first of the Jewish festivals, known as Passover, because the angel of the Lord passed over the Jewish households who had followed what God had told them through Moses. Then the Israelites all leave Egypt, but Pharaoh sends an army after them, with God miraculously intervening to part the waters of the Sea of Reeds. Exact location unknown. And the Israelites pass through before Pharaoh's armies are drowned. After 3 months of travel, during which God miraculously provides food and water for the Israelites, they then arrive in the wilderness of Sinai and set up camp at the bottom of the mountain. From chapter 19 of Exodus through to the end of Leviticus covers just 13 months with the Israelites camped at Sinai this whole time. And it is at Mount Sinai, in the desert, that Moses listens to God and receives the law. More on this later. And so Moses spends 40 days up the mountain receiving instructions from God, including how to build the tabernacle, a tent and courtyard where God would have a sanctuary among the people. But the people worried that Moses had been gone too long and asked Aaron, Moses' brother, to make them a golden calf, an idol like those they'd seen in Egypt. This is the first, and one of the clearest, examples of a pattern seen throughout the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, of God renewing his covenant with his people, who wander and stray and need to be called back to God in repentance. Our third book is Leviticus. The Hebrew name for this book is Vayikra, again taking the first words of the book, and he called. And the book opens with God detailing to Moses the offerings that the Israelites were to bring. The English name Leviticus tells us that the book focuses on the duties of the tribe of Levi and the priests who were from that tribe. Whereas all of Genesis and most of Exodus are comprised of historical narrative, you may find Leviticus harder reading, as it's perhaps the book which is most like a legal textbook, with large passages giving instructions, rules, and regulations for the people of Israel. It contains what has been called a holiness code, with God commanding the Jews to be holy, for I am holy. The origins of most of the Jewish festivals are found in this book. There are 3 more spring festivals: unleavened bread for 7 days after Passover, First fruits, marking the harvest of barley, begins on the second day of unleavened bread. The Festival of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, marks the beginning of the wheat harvest. There are also 3 autumn festivals: Rosh Hashanah, which is the beginning of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and Sukkot, the Festival of Tabernacles. With instructions for Passover found in Exodus, the remaining 2 ancient Jewish festivals are Purim, the origins of which can be found at the end of the book of Esther during the time of Esther, and Hanukkah, which marks the rededication of the temple after the Maccabean revolt, well over 1,000 years after the events described in the Torah. Our 4th book is Numbers. The English name Numbers refers to the 2 censuses which God commanded Moses to take of the Israelites at the beginning and end of the book. The Hebrew name Bamidbar means in the wilderness, taken from the end of the first sentence. God spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. After a year at Sinai, the people hold the first remembrance of the Passover, before leaving the mountain, with God leading them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They arrive at the edge of the land of Canaan, and 12 spies are sent into the land, 1 from each of the tribes of Israel. 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, say that God will lead them into the land, but the other 10 are afraid of what they see. The people rebel, and God decrees that none of the adults who came from Egypt and witnessed all the miracles in the wilderness will enter the promised land. Towards the end of the book of Numbers, Aaron dies on Mount Hor in the 5th month of the 40th year since they came out of Egypt. So this book covers a period of 38 years and 9 months of Israel's history. Our 5th and final book is Deuteronomy. The Hebrew title, Devarim, meaning words, is again taken from the first words of the book. These are the words, as we hear how Moses spoke to the Israelites as they were on the other side of the Jordan River. That is, they hadn't yet entered the promised land. The English title Deuteronomy means second law, because in this book Moses recounts the law to the people before they entered the promised land. What we have recorded is effectively a series of Moses' sermons in written form. As I said earlier, the book ends with the death of Moses, having seen the promised land, and with the passing of the leadership onto Joshua. It recounts Moses finishing the writing of this book of the Torah and the instructions for the Levites to keep it safe with the Ark of the Covenant. Now, let's focus on the law. Torah, the law, has always been central to Jewish life and religious observance. But when we say the word law today, we perhaps picture criminal courts and lawyers wearing wigs, or speed cameras, or cease and desist letters. Whilst we're probably never going to get away from Torah being translated into English as law, we need to understand that Torah conveys the idea of teaching and instruction rather than simply a set of legal rules, and that even the narrative or story portions of the Torah are also there to teach us about God. There are, however, a lot of instructions in the Torah, which are given as rules or as law in the more literal sense. Almost everyone will have heard of the 10 Commandments and be able to picture a bearded Charlton Heston figure coming down from Mount Sinai carrying stone tablets engraved with these laws. When I studied Judaism for A-levels, it was asserted that there are 613 commandments, or mitzvah, in the Torah. And I always took this at face value. If centuries of rabbis had come to this conclusion, I felt no need to count them for myself. Now, 613 mitzvot may sound like a lot to those who perhaps thought there were only 10 commandments in the Bible. But the reality is that it's a very small number of laws to govern an entire nation of God's people. In the UK, we have the Highway Code, which summarises the law and guidance for road users, and it contains just 307 rules. 307 rules just to describe how to use roads safely in the UK, compared to 613 rules to describe the whole of life in ancient Israel. Now, that's not quite true. Whilst the 613 is a long-established tradition, there is not complete agreement on which of the commands in the Torah are included. The 613 number also only covers those laws which have been seen as applicable to all Jews throughout the ages. The single commandment given to Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge is not included. Neither is the command to be holy, or the instructions on how the tabernacle was to be built. There are also currently many of the 613 which cannot be fulfilled today, as there is no king, high priest, priesthood or temple in Jerusalem. Only perhaps a few hundred are currently able to be observed. There are more than 100 laws covering the sacrifices and offerings that needed to be given. And there are between 20 to 30 laws covering each of the following topics: diet, sex, marriage, taxes, Sabbath years, the sanctuary, criminal law, and the Jewish calendar. And there are almost 50 laws covering the worship of idols. But the actual rules in the Torah are not numbered and are not given in the type of legalese that we might expect of laws today. There are two broad types of laws. Some are apodictic, that is, they're absolute commands that apply to everyone. Thou shalt not murder would be a good example of a negatively expressed universal command which always applies to all people. And walk in God's ways would be a positive example which would again apply to all God's people for all times. And both of these laws are also moral laws. Other commands are casuistic, examples of case law. That is, they only apply to certain people in certain circumstances. For example, soldiers going to war were commanded to carry a small shovel along with their weapons in case they needed to relieve themselves. This only applied if you were a soldier and if you were going to war. But all of the laws are designed to be paradigmatic. That is, they provided examples which could then be applied elsewhere. For example, the requirement to put a rail around the side of your roof sets a precedent for putting good safety measures in place. Likewise, the rule that says that anyone who leaves a hole uncovered is liable for the ox that falls into it would also be liable if a chicken or lamb fell into it. Now, there are some rules which perhaps don't seem to have any good logical reason. For example, the kosher food laws. Some have suggested that the rules around not eating pork or shellfish would have had health benefits in the wilderness, but not to boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, or not to wear garments made from a wool or linen mix, don't seem to have any obvious physical benefit, but perhaps instead point to deeper truths about motivations and purity. Some of the commands and punishments may sound harsh to us, but the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was not expected to be taken literally, but expressed that the punishment should fit the crime, no more and no less, with monetary amounts set for different infractions. All of the commands came from God, but it's been well said that there is a hierarchy to the commands. By the time of Jesus, the Pharisees were able to say that just two of the commands were the most important, and Jesus himself confirmed this. If anyone truly kept these two, then they would have kept the whole law. Then there were the rules known as the 10 Commandments, which could be said to expand on the 2 Great Commandments, providing very simple rules from which we could then extrapolate many of the others. So is the law still relevant today? And should Christians be keeping all the laws from the Torah? In mid-2005, an agnostic Jewish journalist decided to embark on a self-described spiritual journey to follow the commands of the Bible, and particularly the Torah, as literally as possible, with his main aim being to write a book about the experience. Side effects included finding himself genuinely exclaiming, "Praise the Lord," whilst on a tour of Israel, and spontaneously praying for the safety of his son when he had an accident. Now, although he didn't end up embracing either Hasidic Judaism or evangelical Christianity, the experience clearly had a profound effect on A.J. Jacobs, and at the end of his journey he describes himself as a reverent agnostic. Now, living by the law in and of itself will not make you a believer or a follower, which echoes the words of Paul in the New Testament. The law itself is a big part of the law, but I would argue that it isn't the central thing that we should take away. Why was the Torah given then? Perhaps another command mentioned earlier and repeated 3 times in Leviticus gives us a clue. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Not that by religiously observing a set of rules anyone could ever obtain purity, but the law helps us to understand just how holy God is. In his letter to the Romans, Paul says that by the law comes the knowledge of sin, that in understanding the law, not just the rules and regulations, but the entirety of the books of Moses, we come to understand God's plan and purpose. Why do we have the Torah? The Torah was given first to the Jewish people to remind them that the God who created the heavens and the earth had chosen them, singling out their ancestors to be the means through which all peoples would be brought to God. It covers human history from the very beginning to just before the people of Israel would enter the land that God had promised them. And there are parts that read like a founding document, like the US Constitution. There are other parts that are historical narrative. There are songs, there are laws and instruction. But most of all, there is the plan of God. For Jews today, the Torah is still their foundation, and the Torah scrolls are read in the synagogue each Sabbath morning. And some Jews will follow the Torah literally, religiously, alongside the oral law passed down in the Mishnah and Talmud. But even Jewish atheists will often still remember the festivals, may fast for Yom Kippur, or enjoy Friday night dinner with their extended family to honour the Sabbath. Whilst the legal system in Israel today looks more like those in the West, these Western legal systems were in turn originally based on Old Testament law as filtered through centuries of Christianity. For Christians too, the Torah should not be a dusty set of books to be forgotten. The New Testament does not do away with the Old. Jesus said that not even the smallest letter or stroke of a letter would be done away with. An understanding of the Old Testament, and particularly the Torah, will enable us to understand covenant, sin, sacrifice, redemption, sanctification, and many more key principles of our Christian faith far better than we would otherwise. In fact, Jesus underlined how the letter of the law was supposed to be understood spiritually. That anger was the equivalent of murder, and looking with lust was the equivalent of adultery. Jesus instructs us to learn what Hosea meant when he prophesies that God desires love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than offerings. So I hope that this short introduction to the Torah has been useful and that it has answered some of your questions. But most of all, I hope that it's given you a deeper desire to open up the Bible and particularly the Torah for yourself and see what God has to say to you through it. Thank you for listening.